Welcome to the Why Not You podcast, where our goal is to inspire, teach, and elevate your personal journey. Our heart-centered guests love sharing some of their life-changing aha moments, hoping that it might be of benefit to you. Welcome to the Why Not You podcast. Karl Beckstrand is with us today. He is a children's author. He's an illustrator, a publisher, a professor, a speaker. He's bilingual. I mean, gosh, is there much you haven't done, Karl? Welcome to our show today.
Thank you, Glade. I'm happy to be here.
Well, Karl, before we get going, I would like to kind of give our listeners a 30,000-foot view of where you grew up, your childhood, that type of thing. Can you share that with us?
Sure. I was born and raised in San Jose, California. I watched it transform from an agricultural valley to Silicon Valley, served an LDS mission in Chile, graduated with an undergraduate degree from journalism at BYU, got a master's degree in political science and conflict resolution, and got my first book published in 2004, worked with a couple of publishers early on, and then decided that I had learned enough to start my own publishing company. And now I have Cameo Publishing. We have about 200 multicultural products.
Well, how did you get started in publishing? I mean, you have quite a background there, different things. What was your turning point, or what made you decide to go to be a publisher or a writer or author?
Yeah, it's funny because I didn't like to read or write when I was a kid until I discovered that books could be fun. All I had seen were mostly textbooks. They were boring. But once I found that books could transport me, I was hooked. And then at BYU, when I should have been doing my homework, I kept getting story ideas and I'd scribble them down. And so my first books were all children's picture books. And I kind of expanded a little bit by making them Spanish-English with a pronunciation guide. Everything builds on itself, I think. You go with what you learned from the first book and you expand to another, try different things. But I joined the League of Utah Writers. In fact, before I joined them, I met a gentleman at one of their events who said he would publish one of my manuscripts. And the day we were going to print, he passed away. So I got a crash course in marketing and in all the things that come after printing. And then, like I say, I worked with one other publisher after that and had learned enough, I felt, that could avoid that middleman. Started my own company.
Awesome. So, Karl, I know how difficult it was for me to write that first book, but how about you? Was it a little bit easier, and where did it lead from there?
The first book that I wrote was called Crumbs on the Stairs, a Mystery. And that's been my bestseller. And that's the one I illustrated. And I'm not a professional illustrator, so it's kind of weird. But the first book that was published was called Sounds in the House. And both of those books kind of just came to me. I remember sitting down and writing Sounds in the House in one sitting. That was the manuscript that my first publisher liked. And he got an illustrator and put that together and got everything set up for printing.
And what were some of your biggest challenges in just getting started with that first book or first few books?
So I didn't expect that I would get published as young as I did, even though I think I was in my 30s. I thought it would always be later after I was done working in my day job and, finally persuaded a publisher to pick me up. But as I mentioned, I went to a League of Utah Writers event, manuscripts in hand. I was such a greenie walking around with my manuscripts. Anybody know an agent? Anybody know someone who will publish these? And this very generous gentleman here in Utah who had published a series of books, read through the manuscripts right there on the spot. And it wasn't even an official event. I think it was a picnic. He was there to have fun, but he was magnanimous enough to read my manuscripts. And he pulled out Sounds in the House and he says, let's do this. And that's how it happened.
Just showed up to a picnic and that started the journey. I've thought a lot about this, Karl. I believe that there's a story inside of every one of us. And I think that where I want to go with this podcast today is to talk about the process of getting that story out. Because whether it's our own posterity or whether we can help other people along the way, we are all going through this journey of life. And we think that we live in a perfect world. Everyone else's world is perfect and ours is totally amiss. So let's focus on the process.
Sure.
And I really want to encourage people to get that story out because we can help people along the way.
Sure. And I agree. Everybody does have a story. It's just that many times people aren't aware of it. That there's a catchphrase nowadays where they say, make a message from your mess. And I believe that. I believe that everybody goes through things that teach them great lessons and can share those lessons if they share the story.
Well, so let's talk about the process. How do you get started? What is like step one?
Well, there is no step one because people write in different ways. Some people are plotters. Some people are quote unquote pantsers, where they write by the seat of their pants. And I'm somewhere in between. So a plotter is someone who likes to create an outline and get everything down on paper and do it in order, chronologically, beginning to end. And they're very structured. Pantsers just sit down and start writing. And sometimes it's free association writing. They just want to get words on paper and then they'll organize it and clean it up later. So for me, some of my stories have come to me intact. I mean, a kid's story isn't that long. So I've sat down and written a children's story in 20 minutes. But other children's stories have happened over 6 months of writing and working on it. So it really is different for each writer.
Well, Karl, you mentioned that these stories attacked you. What does that look like? Did you wake up in the middle of the night? Did they just come to you? And then where did you go from there when they attacked you?
Precisely. They wake me up in the middle of the night and I have to write them down. Otherwise, I can't go back to sleep. But yes, so for me, my early stories just came and I wrote them down. And then I tweaked here and there and then had an editor make sure that they were correct. But they were intact as I wrote them pretty much. But later stories took some research. I had to go through family journals, letters, do a little bit more organizing and choosing which things to include in the story, which things not to include, things like that. And then, of course, I've written a novel, I've written short stories, and I've written a self-help book. And those, wow, take a lot more time and planning and structure. You have to have an objective in those cases, I think.
Right. Yeah, you have to have something clear in mind what you want to do. And I know we have to kind of tread lightly here that you had some experiences with bigger named publishers, and it led you to creating your own publishing company. What can you share without naming names and all that kind of stuff?
Sure. Well, my first publisher was wonderful. And the only reason that relationship ended was because he passed away. But his widow was very generous. She shared with me some of the tips that he had accumulated for marketing. Here are things you can do to get your book out there. So that was so helpful. And then the second publisher I worked with, the story was Anna's Prayer. And it's the true story of an immigrant girl. It's my great aunt who immigrated from Sweden. And the basis of the story, everything that happens in the story happened because the family was so poor. But the illustrator that they brought in created these lovely, beautiful images of a very wealthy family. It didn't make sense with all the things that happened to them. This nice clothing and surroundings. And so I said to the publisher, this is a problem. This doesn't fit. And they said, well, we'll just take out the paragraph that says they were poor. That was my first.
Yeah, and that was the meat of the message. That was the apex of the journey.
Yeah. So,
wow.
And then there are strict rules, or there have been strict rules that artists are not to communicate with illustrators. And I broke that rule. I didn't know. I reached out to the illustrator and I said, can we maybe change the look of this slightly? And they were furious with me. And yeah, and it was
so control. I mean, it was all about control for them. And what you wanted to do was tell the story.
Right.
And that's what kind of led you to the self-publishing thing.
Yeah.
Control, real content, real story, not something fabricated.
Yeah. And then just on a practical matter, not having a middleman who takes a huge percentage of the profits is very helpful.
Gotcha. So let's say that somebody's got, I've helped some people who have their journals, their life history that they wanted to kind of organize and put into a book and publish. Not necessarily to make any money, but it was more of an assembly of their life experiences that they wanted their family to know. And so is it necessary to have a publisher? Is it necessary to find an editor?
No. Well, an editor is always helpful, even if you're just writing for family. But for that kind of thing, you want to be a plotter. You want to sit down and write an outline. And you can do it with dates, the date of your birth, the date of your college or marriage or work, starting your career. You start and you write down those dates first, and then you start to fill in the details in between the dates. And you can get fuller and fuller as you go and as you remember. That might be a little bit mundane for people who are accustomed to reading novels or narratives that are, professionally crafted and edited. But you can find your own style. You can find your own voice. And maybe there's a theme throughout your life that you want to focus on, a theme of covering your gifts or learning how your family history has influenced your choices, things like that. But again, having input from others always helps. I am a member of the League of Utah Writers, or have been. I don't know if I renewed my membership, but they have meetings where you can meet with other writers, editors, exchange your manuscripts, get what we call beta readers, people who will read your manuscript if you'll read theirs. And this way, you're getting feedback that's not just from your mom who loves everything you do.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's a really good idea. I had no idea that there was those kinds of organizations out there that if you read my manuscript, then I'll read yours and give feedback.
Right. It's very helpful.
And then, okay, so then after they have a manuscript and they've done some editing, what then?
So technology has really equalized the playing field in publishing. I mean, the giant publishers still have prestige, and they used to have a monopoly on distribution, but they don't anymore. So mostly the advantage of having a big publisher is prestige, and I can't think of any other advantage beyond that.
Right.
So disadvantages are that they control the content, they control the marketing or lack of marketing, and they control the money. So those are 3 reasons why I decided to publish myself. But technology makes it so that you can. There are companies that will help you do print on demand. Ingram Spark or Ingram Lightning Source will do hardcover books and ebooks where you just upload the files. The book doesn't exist until the customer orders it. They click on it, and then that book prints and ships to them, and you never touch it, but you get money back. Amazon has a similar company, Kindle Direct Publishing. Also, Draft to Digital does this with ebooks, and they will distribute it for you for free on all major ebook platforms. So it's just a matter of uploading the files, like PDF or other file.
Okay, Karl, I'm sure that you've had so many people come to you as being a publisher and helping, and an illustrator and whatnot. I'm sure you've had many people come to you with an idea or a concept, and they don't follow through. What can you say to our listeners to give them encouragement or hope to just go through the messy middle that I call it, doing the hard work?
Sure. The number one piece of advice I give is sit down every day at the same time and write, even if it's for 10 minutes. But get yourself in the same place, the same chair every day and write something. And if you'll make a habit of that, even if it's 10 minutes a day, it'll add up over time. A couple of years, you'll have a novel.
Stephen King, evidently, he's one of the best authors and whatnot. I don't know how many words it is a day, but he every single day does that very thing. And of course, the rub on that is people say, well, that's Stephen King. He's an author and that's, it's easy for him. But then the other side of the coin is, well, maybe that's why he is Stephen King, is because he has that discipline and that rigor to do it every single day.
Right. Yeah. For me as a publisher, I wear many hats. I have to do accounting. I have to do royalty payments, do taxes and marketing. And so it quickly started to crowd out my writing, and I didn't want that. So my routine is that the first thing I do when I sit down at my desk is to research and write. That's my first project of the day before anything else.
Do you have a certain amount of words that you want to do a day, or is it time?
No, it's neither. As long as I will start my day with the writing, then I will allow myself to put it aside after even 5 minutes if I have fires to put out, if I have things that really need my attention. But I make sure that I do the writing first thing. And that's how I fit it in. Otherwise, it would never fit in.
Right. And the self-publishing thing is, I've written about 4 or 5 books. I've only published 2. It was a little bit overwhelming, honestly. And the first one, you can kind of see it there in the background. This one right there, Sugar Bees to Shanghai. That was 15, 18 years that I was writing. And I just didn't dare publish it. I sent the manuscript out to a couple of close people, and they were brutally honest, and it hurt my ego, and it sat for years. And then finally, I was just like, okay, I've got to get an editor. I'll let him do his skill, his craft. And then after it was done, it was like, wow, this is, they say it in such a different way. And I am so verbose. I just, I say the same thing 5 different ways, and so he was just able to cut through all that and create, something that I was proud of. So I totally agree about the editor thing.
Yeah. Well, kudos to you for not giving up.
Well, it was difficult, but it was very rewarding to me personally. I didn't care if I sold one book, if I made 10 cents on it. It was just the self-gratification that I did it. And you've done a lot of books. You personally, how do you use an editor? And what does that feel like to you when you've put this book down in your mind and in your terms? What does it look like when it comes back all marked up, redlined and say, oh, cut this, that's too much. That's, that type of thing. Because that happens.
Yeah. I think it's easy to get over any sense of rejection by just remembering that, oh, I'm so relieved that this one person caught all those mistakes rather than a million readers, right?
That's a good concept. Yeah.
It's not terribly painful when you consider, oh boy, am I glad this one person caught that. And as you work with editors, you realize they're your friend and they're going to help you and they know what they're doing. Hopefully you'll hire people who are well recommended and know what they're doing and who are professionals and not just, someone who studied English once. But yeah, I've had editors do things that I didn't like. The wonderful thing about it is that as the author, you have final say. If you're not working with a giant publishing house, you have final say as to what is actually said in the end. You can take an edit with a grain of salt. You don't have to incorporate it into your book. The other thing that's wonderful about the editing process is it's an education. And the more books you have edited and the more feedback you've seen on your own writing, the more your writing will improve.
Well, that's a great point. It was fun and it was rewarding. But what I found through that process was writing brings clarity to Glade Polson. I mean, in journaling, I haven't been a big journaler until the last 4 or 5 years, but in journaling and in writing, I get clarity.
I agree. And I think it does that for everybody, for anyone who writes. Glade, I think a lot of people go through much of their life thinking, oh, that person has that skill and that person has this other skill and I'm not good at this or that. But really, the people that we see that are good at things have practiced. I mean, there are some innate gifts, but even those, if they're not developed, it just has to be a matter of practice, persistence, like you've shown with your book. And then always you can hire an editor to help you clean it up. So that's excellent.
Yeah. Okay, so once you've got the book written, it's been edited and whatnot, how do you find a publisher? How important are those publishers, or how much do you help people in the publishing process, being a publisher yourself?
Sure. I mean, I give people my input, my experience if they ask. So if you're determined to go and work with a large publishing house, if you want that prestige, then you'll have to get an agent because most of those big publishers, if not all, don't even look at manuscripts anymore that come self-submitted. They only look at manuscripts submitted by a known agent, literary agent. And again, the prestige to me just isn't worth it. Actually, if a large publisher approached me on a new book of mine and said they wanted to distribute it, I would look at their offer because the prestige can help in ways that, that I haven't had.
But it seems to me like all the big publishing companies, they're going out of business. They're all broke.
Well, they're not all going out of business. They're reinventing themselves in this new technological age. I don't think they'll disappear. And the thing, there's a trade-off. I would look at a contract from a publisher simply because they would offer a volume of sales that maybe I wouldn't get without them. And even though the royalty might be smaller for me because they're taking their huge, gigantic cut, the volume of sales might be worth me going into a contract on that, if that makes sense.
Gotcha.
But typically, I like to control the marketing. I like to be in charge of getting the word out about my books. I feel like I do it better than many publishers because I'm more passionate about it, understandably, because it's my story. Who's more passionate than me?
Yeah. What's the biggest challenge with once you've published the book? What's the biggest challenge for this guy here with his book, Sugar Beets to Shanghai? What's the biggest challenge?
I think you know what it is. It's the marketing, getting the word out.
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah. And that's where the expense comes in. It's interesting with technology. You don't have to pay a penny to publish. You can do everything. You'll probably want to compensate your editor. But other than that, you can get the book out without spending anything. But after that's where the expense comes. Advertisements, marketing, social media ads, things like that.
What does that look like, Karl?
Exactly. What does that look
Yeah, because the reality is, okay, I went through all the whole process. I published the book and, send it out to a few friends and family and whatnot. And, I think I've, sold a book or two. That's about it, And then it was like, okay, you had to have reviews. You had to have this, and you had to have a 5-star review, and just the different things that had to go in for anybody to even know about it.
Yeah. You could spend the rest of your life just listening to webinars on how to market your book because there are that many out there. And then they're evolving and marketing is evolving. And so when I say exactly that's the question, it's because we're always learning how to market our books. But typically, press releases still work very well. Email lists still work very well. Yes, getting reviews. You can get reviews from people that you know, but you can also get reviews from large organizations like Kirkus or the Horn Book or Library Journal or Publishers Weekly. All of those kinds of reviews have helped my prestige and my status a lot. And I believe they've impacted sales. You can, do social media posts. You can do Amazon advertising. You can public appearances and speaking and book signings. So there's a lot of elements for book marketing that you just have to try and see what works and what doesn't. Try not to spend too much money on any one thing until you know that it's effective.
Right. And I would assume that with how long you've been doing this, Karl? How long, your publishing company, was it 2004 or something like that? Is when
18.5 years.
Okay. So I would assume that over those, dozens and dozens and hundreds of books that you've published and promoted, and you've built email lists and distribution lists and publishing forums or platforms or something to where you can really help people get their books out.
Yes. And I've been approached by people who wanted me to help them or join them in, a marketing webinar, a publishing webinar. And I've always backed out. I've always said no, because I'd rather work on my writing and
right.
my company. What I did is I created a cheat sheet for people who inquire, what are the steps? So it's basically a timeline that I'll email to people. Here's how you can publish, and I don't charge for that. If they have questions, I'll answer their questions. But the idea is that there are so many people offering the same information that my voice joined with just another webinar wouldn't make that much of a difference.
Well, your experience and your wisdom and the things that you have learned, that has to just be huge. It has to be a huge help to someone.
Well, I hope so. Again, I'm still learning.
Well, aren't we all? I mean, we learn every single day. And the minute we stop learning, we start going backwards. So, and technology is evolving so quickly nowadays that it's a daily learning experience. Your biggest piece of advice, Karl, for someone that is thinking about doing this, what is your biggest piece of advice for them?
So I give you my biggest writing advice, which is to sit down at the same time every day. And my biggest marketing piece of advice would be always treat your book as if it were brand new, which means never stop marketing it. The big publishers, I think they lose a lot of money by doing a big marketing blitz once in a while for a celebrity author, but not for all their authors. Anyway, they'll do a big marketing blitz for like 3 months, and then they will never touch that title again. They will never do a thing in the future to help people know about that book. Whereas I'm still marketing my first book as if it were brand new, and I'm still making money off of that book.
So is it different publishing children's books than adult books or fiction versus nonfiction?
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So if you're going to go through a large publishing house, they used to want to find their own illustrators and connect the manuscript with the illustrator themselves. But now there are people who are author/illustrators who have submitted their work, and the publishers have accepted them and printed and published them. But still, generally, many publishers like to connect the manuscript with an illustrator that they find. If you're going to self-publish, you've got to find your own illustrator. And you can do that often at universities. There are graphics and illustration departments that have graduates that are looking for work, and they'll have a portfolio online that you can look at. And you can go through and see if there's a style of art that kind of matches your story. And you can reach out to that student and ask them, what kind of compensation would you want? Would you want a flat fee? Would you want royalties? Things like that. And you can set up an agreement, get that all done yourself.
Well, Karl, the whole process, I'm sure, seems a little bit overwhelming to most. And if you could give people encouragement to just do it and don't take it personal, but just do it and learn from the process and get connected with the right people. If you could just give the people, our listeners, some encouragement, I would like to hear some stories maybe of someone like that who you've helped along the way that has really blossomed because of the tutelage and the help and the process that you go through.
Well, I like to think that my illustrators have had a lot of exposure thanks to my books. I've worked with several illustrators. Some are repeats, that have done 2 or 3 books or have just done 1 book. But I hope that in each case, they have had other work come from that. They've been able to, I always give them permission to post the images online or in a portfolio or any way they like, as long as they're not sharing the entire story. And in that way, they can show off what they do. As far as other authors, I distribute a couple other authors. And so I think their reach is broader because of my distribution. I actually have agreements with the large wholesalers in the country, just like a big publishing house. And the average author can set up agreements with those big wholesalers. So no longer is it a monopoly for the big publishers. And that's a big advantage. So yeah, hopefully there are people who have had more fans, more exposure because of being associated with me.
Well, I'm sure that's the case. Well, is there any final thing that you'd like to share with our listeners today, Karl? I mean, anything that comes to your mind?
Oh, well, you talked about the challenges of writing different genres. So I've written a Western novel and I've collaborated. It's funny, I've collaborated with a few dead authors. The Western novel was a collaboration with my grandfather who passed away 25 years ago. My mother gave me his manuscript that he had tried to get published while he was alive.
Interesting.
And when I first read the first few pages, it seemed like a very cliche Western, and I set it down and I didn't look at it for a couple of years. But once I picked it up and read the whole thing, it was actually an excellent book. It just needed some character development and some plot holes fixed. And so that's what I did. And we won an International Book Award.
You've won a number of awards with your books. Is that your highest award, or were there others in the children's story genre that you excelled at?
Yeah, so there's different kinds of recognition, I guess. Forward Reviews magazine put one of my kids' books in their top 10 books of the year. In 2011, they did that. School Library Journal also highlighted that same book. It's called She Doesn't Want the Worms, in English and Spanish. And then I've received awards for cover design, and I do the layout for my books. And I've actually illustrated about 6 of them myself. So it's nice to get recognized for art or cover design, layout, things like that.
Well, that's awesome. Well, you've had a storied career so far, and I know how hard it is to just author one book, let alone, 60, 70 different books. So kudos to you. And I'm sure the marketing side of things, that was just one side of the whole process that I had no clue about.
Yeah, it's a learning curve for everyone.
And that's what you do. I mean, every day, so I'll put in the show notes, Karl, exactly how to get in touch with you. I know you do speaking engagements. I know you're a teacher at a school there in Utah. I know that you have a publishing company, that you're a writer yourself. You have many talents that you would love to share with people. So I'll put in the show notes how people get in touch with you and maybe get that free list of how to get started. And then, it can go from there.
Super. Well, thank you, Glade.
Well, thank you for spending time with us today. I hope that we have, get some people to take that next step, to just get out there, be vulnerable, put it down, do the work, and who knows what you'll discover. We'd like to thank our guests for sharing a part of their experience with us on this episode of Why Not You? Also, we'd like to thank Mix It 6 Studios for producing, editing, mixing, and creating our great music for this podcast. But most importantly, we'd like to thank you for listening. Be sure to leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Also, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next episode of Why Not You? See you next time.